even like psychoanalysts 100 years ago were talking about that. And there was a guy named Otto Rank who basically posited that the first major traumatic experience that all human beings go through is birth. And so if we think about what anxiety is like worry about the future, right? What if things don't work out? Kids will be exquisitely sensitive to the moods of their parents. And for those of you that sort of grew up in households where unfortunately you experienced some amount of abuse or maybe like drinking in the house, you'll remember that you were exquisitely sensitive to your parents' moods.
I was once happy, content, sloshing around in my own private primordial pool. Then one day, for reasons beyond my control, I was repeatedly crushed over and over by the cruel cervix of my mother, Leslie.
So the show actually starts off with this image. And it starts off with like this fetus, presumably Rue, who's kind of the protagonist, being in the womb, right? And what happens when we're in the womb is we're content. So if we think a little bit about like the womb, right? So the womb is like a place where we have an umbilical cord that's connected to our mother, usually. And that umbilical cord kind of supplies us with everything that we need. So all of our waste products, like all of the results of cellular metabolism are sent out through the umbilical cord. All of our glucose, our fats, our everything that we need, even hormones and things like that, are sort of transmitted through the umbilical cord. We're very protected in this environment. So we're filled, the uterus is filled with something called amniotic fluid. And the amniotic fluid like protects us from things like bumps, right? So if my mother is walking down the street and the pavement is kind of rocky, the amniotic fluid is going to protect me against vibration. It's going to protect me against sound. It's going to protect me against everything. And so what sort of people realize is that like the womb is sort of the perfect environment, right? It's dark. It's just kind of filled with relative contentment. And the interesting thing is that even like psychoanalysts 100 years ago were talking about that. And there was a guy named Otto Rank who basically posited that the first major traumatic experience that all human beings go through is birth. So prior to birth, we're perfectly content, right? And like, we don't have any needs. There's nothing wrong in the world because we're not even aware of what we are, but all of our needs are getting met. And the second that we were born, suddenly like something drastic changes, right? So we're not, this is where things kind of like evolve into discomfort. So all of our needs are met. And then when we're born, suddenly like we're capable of feeling cold. We're capable of feeling hungry. We're capable of feeling alone. We're capable of feeling frightened. Suddenly, like all of these things change. Like we're not perfectly protected in a temperature stable environment. Sights can be scary. Lights can be bright. Sounds can disturb our rest. Whereas in the womb, none of these things happen. So Otto Rank sort of showed up and he kind of hypothesized that the most basic trauma that human beings experience is the process of being born. And there's some interesting physiologic kind of connotations to this. So for example, when children are born, they have spikes of cortisol. So cortisol is a stress hormone. And literally that cortisol helps with things like lung maturity. So even the process of being born, the stressful experience and all the crying that you experience has a physiologic effect of boosting your cortisol level. And that boosting of your cortisol level actually helps our lungs understand, hey, we need to start breathing, and prepares our lungs for breathing. Which is why if we have premature babies, sometimes what we'll do is we'll have to use cortisol injections to prepare them for birth and like being able to optimally survive in the external world. So there are a lot of other interesting psychoanalytic theories about birth trauma. So people sort of posited that the most basic form of anxiety or discomfort happens during birth trauma. So there was another analyst named Bion, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, Bion, who basically talked about how the basic imprint of anxiety and trauma is like through birth trauma. So what he sort of noted was that as we're born, if you think about the infant brain within hours of birth or even days or weeks of birth, we don't really like have the capacity to understand what's going on. we don't even understand like what emotions are. All we have are these raw, unfiltered experiences. So in this infant brain, like you just feel hungry, right? And you don't even know what hungry is. All you know is that there are all these signals that are working their way through your body that make you feel discontent. And you have no control. Like you don't understand what's going on. You feel bad. You don't even know in what way things are bad. And you're completely at the mercy of the world, right? Do you get fed or do you not get fed? Do you get cold? Do you get changed? Do you get warmed up? Do they put a beanie on your head? Do they not put a beanie on your head? So it's kind of this unfiltered roller coaster of negative experience followed by contentment, hopefully, in which you kind of like get milk drunk and you pass out and then you wake up again and you're hungry. And then you're back to this like unfiltered state of discomfort. And so this was very, very fundamentally, analysts sort of believe that this is incredibly traumatic and lays the foundation on a very core level of anxiety. And so if we think about what anxiety is like worry about the future, right? What if things don't work out? What if? And if we think a little bit about how does the human brain learn to fear the future? How does it learn to be anxious? It's through this birthing process, or at least that's the theory that these people would posit, right? That suddenly now you're in this world where like you don't know how long the contentment is going to last. And you're just getting bodied by all of these weird sensations, frustration, being hungry, needing to get changed, feeling uncomfortable, feeling afraid, but you don't even know what those are. So those experiences, when sort of put into the fetal mind or the infant mind, are just so incredibly traumatic because there's no way to process them. So there are also like, criticisms or other perspectives on this, but I think it's really interesting that the show essentially talks about this contentment as the beginning of things. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at a lot of this traumatic birth kind of stuff, what they sort of talk a little bit about is the way that children learn to navigate this in a healthy way or unhealthy way, the way that we learn that anxiety is to be feared above all else, or the way that our anxiety gets reassured is actually through our original like maternal parent or paternal bonding. So when children are born, they bond. And this show also is kind of really interesting because they talk a little bit about the state into which the main character was born.
I was born 3 days after 9/11.
I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of it
My mother and father spent 2 days in the hospital, holding me under the soft glow of the television.
So the main character, I think, was born right around 9/11. And so they talk a little bit about how their parents, for the first 48 hours of their life, were just watching stuff related to the Twin Towers and the terrorist attacks. And this kind of makes me wonder because, like, this sort of bonding that happens between children and parents is so important. And so what happens to a child who is bonding with a mother or father who are like concerned about 9/11, right? So the world was shocked. People are grieving. People are like worried. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. People like sort of think the world is going to end. It's very, very shocking. And if the parents are sort of for 48 hours sitting in a hospital room where they're obsessing over 9/11, what impact does that have on maternal child bonding, right? Because the interesting thing to remember is that children, when we're born, we don't really have logic. We don't have really emotional awareness. We have no way of communicating or understanding other people. All children have is empathy, right? So like the most important circuit, the most important way to communicate and interact with a child is empathy. So parents sort of develop a feeling for, okay, is this kid doing okay? Is this not doing okay? And similarly, kids will be exquisitely sensitive to the moods of their parents. And for those of you that sort of grew up in households where unfortunately you experienced some amount of abuse or maybe like drinking in the house, you'll remember that you were exquisitely sensitive to your parents' moods. So we've had people that we've interviewed, and this is not just people we've interviewed here, but this is my experience as a clinician. If you talk to kids who grew up in abusive households, they know within seconds of seeing the parent whether they're in trouble that day or not. They're exquisitely sensitive to the mood of others. And so it starts to beg the question, like, if we grow up in a particular situation where our parents are grieving, our parents are paranoid, our parents are concerned, what does that do to the anxiety that was laid down by our birth trauma? And this is where it's kind of interesting, because from the get-go, we can explore things like attachment theory. So attachment theory is this idea that how we relate to other human beings depends on something called attachment. And so whether we have secure attachment or anxious attachment or avoidant attachment or fearful attachment, the way that we fundamentally relate to other human beings gets kind of determined very early on. So let's explain this a little bit, because this is important for drug addiction as well. So when I'm a kid, I don't really understand the world, right? Like, the world sort of doesn't make sense to me. So the most important thing that reassures me, the way I fundamentally get my internal anxiety about the world being reassured or not, is the consistency of the world around me. So for example, if you think about a child who becomes confident with gravity, right? So like, if I have a 3-year-old, a 3-year-old is like happy to jump off of sofas, jump onto things, roll around, jump on a trampoline. They're happy to throw balls, pick up balls. Even 1-year-olds will like pick up food and like drop it on the ground, right? So like, kids are confident when it comes to gravity. And why are kids so damn confident when it comes to gravity? Even to the point where parents are like, you have to really watch your kid, because they'll do things that are unsafe when it comes to gravity. They'll jump off of things, they'll jump into things. Like, you have to be really careful about kids, right? Where does that confidence with gravity come from? It comes from consistency. So the cool thing about gravity is gravity doesn't have moods, right? Like, gravity isn't happy one moment and pissed one moment. Gravity isn't sober one moment and like drunk the next moment. So consistency of parenting is what leads to confidence in the child. The second aspect of attachment theory that's really, really important is emotional mirroring, which is related to that consistency. So the other thing to remember is that a 1-year-old doesn't know what they're feeling. So how does a 1-year-old understand what they're feeling? What they actually do is look at the facial expressions of the people around them. So when a 1-year-old gets hurt, what do other adults do? They pick up the child and they're like, oh, poor baby, Witta baby. Is Witta baby okay? Are you all right, Witta baby? Right? So as we do that kind of thing, we sort of like, we show the child what they should be feeling. And so they understand what anger is, because if they're upset, maybe we're going to have to discipline them. If they're acting out and angry, a child may have to be disciplinary. If the child is hurt and falls down, a parent will like pick them up and cuddle them and be like, oh, it's okay, baby, it's okay. And then the other thing that happens is positive reinforcement is also emotionally mirrored in like a greater way. So let's think a little bit about, when the kid draws something that is illegible and they bring it to you with pride. They're like, look, daddy, like, look at this weird thing that I drew. And as you show the weird thing that you drew, the parents are like, oh my God, that's amazing. Look at that. What is that, by the way? I can't really tell. So what we tend to see with kids and early on is that if parents respond to them consistently in an emotionally mirroring and supportive way, those children become securely attached. They become confident about the world. And the reason that they're confident about the world is because the world makes sense, right? And you compare that to, children who grow up with inconsistent caregiving. So this is like a good example of we'll kind of talk about a couple of these examples. So what we tend to find is that, people who are secure have low avoidance and low anxiety, right? So they're like willing to engage. They're willing to try new things. They're not like, they have confidence in themselves. And then we also have like an anxious attachment, which is like when people are very, very high anxiety, but they may be willing to engage with other people. So this comes from sort of inconsistent parenting. And then you'll also have like avoidant attachment. So I think avoidant attachments are very, very classically common in terms of men who have difficulty forming strong emotional bonds. So in avoidant attachments, what sometimes will happen is you'll have a child that shares their emotional needs, which are not met by the parent. And so then what happens is the child starts to resent the parent for not meeting our emotional needs, and then they avoid the parent altogether. So this is the kind of thing where if I share emotional vulnerability and you don't meet me where I'm at, then I'm going to start resenting you. And then what I'm going to learn is to be fiercely independent, right? Because like the lesson that I learned is if I share my emotional needs with people and they don't meet them, then like I can't rely on people. So it doesn't necessarily make me anxious, but it keeps me like separated from other people. So these are people who have struggled to form connections. And if we kind of think about it, it's almost like a protective model where people with avoidant attachment styles will be like very, very careful about, what kind of relationships they form, because they're afraid that like, if I am vulnerable with you, like what's going to happen? I don't know. So the best thing to do is not be emotionally vulnerable to begin with. So there are some interesting experiments that kind of go into this. My point here is that generally speaking, this is protective against drugs, and these three are not protective against drugs. And the cool thing about the show is that the show has different attachment styles that you'll see with different characters that all relate to substance use in some different way, okay? But the key thing here is that if we're talking about the show, like, I don't know what impact, growing up with 9/11 has on attachment. Now, you also have to be careful. I'm kind of overgeneralizing here because there are all kinds of kids that grew up after 9/11 that have good and secure attachment who are alive today. So you can't really draw that one-to-one correlation. But it just sort of makes me wonder a little bit, because if we kind of look at the show really emphasizes some of these concepts, right? And like this is the first 2 minutes of the show, or 60 seconds, 90 seconds of the show, where they kind of talk about the hand that Rue was dealt when Rue came into the world. And that's something that I think is really, really important to think about in terms of addictions. So we tend to think about addictions as diagnoses, right? And we talk about brain stuff and neurotransmitters and genetic vulnerabilities. But the truth is there's a lot of really core stuff involving addictions that I think the show really sets up very well. Next up. Now this is fantastic. So this is actually, before we kind of get to this, I want to talk about one other thing. So the other challenge right now that we tend to see, I think, with substance use is that if you really look at it objectively, this show sort of shows, okay, 9/11 happened. Rue grew up in this kind of situation. She grew up sort of in a world of fear, right? So in the first 10 years of her life, for those of you in the US, like you remember what the post 9/11 world was like, right? So we went to war as the United States. There was an emphasis on terror. The Department of Homeland Security was created. There was a lot of like racism. There was a lot of discrimination that happened. And so like we kind of grew up with this like once in a lifetime event. I think if you look at substance use, right? So we're seeing that substance use is generally speaking getting worse, or not just substance use. Let's just talk about addiction as a whole. So it's not just like chemical addictions, which are getting worse for all kinds of reasons. So some of the reasons that chemical addictions are getting worse, substances are getting worse, it's all kind of fascinating stuff. So the first is that we've been breeding stuff to be more addictive. So if you look at the potency of marijuana has increased drastically over the last like 40 years, right? So people have been like breeding stronger and stronger strains. And that doesn't even include the synthetics. So the other thing that we started doing is getting very, very creative with what kind of synthetic substances we'll make. So there's like Native American, spirit journeys that involve ayahuasca. And now we've isolated DMT, and people will take DMT and they'll take different different kind of chemical modifications of DMT. And so what we're seeing from addictions is that like drugs are getting stronger. They're getting more potent. They're also becoming more nuanced. So this is where we'll get into this in a little bit, but when you get into addiction, people have a drug of choice, right? So some people will really get addicted to one substance over a different substance. And why is that? It's because their neurochemistry, the way their brain is wired, is just a little bit different. There's studies that show that, the dopaminergic or reward response that a particular addict gets from alcohol will be different from what they get from marijuana. Whereas another person may get a huge response from marijuana and very little from alcohol. Now, what you do is you take a world where we have all these different kinds of drugs, right? So it's not just one type of drug. It's not just marijuana. Now you have sativa blends and you have indica blends. You have CBD heavy stuff and you have THC heavy stuff. Not to mention all of the different kinds of synthetic marijuanas like K2, for example, which is highly psychotic and like doesn't really calm people down. It's like the opposite of CBD, where it gives people very, very powerful experiences, but also makes them like kind of crazy. When I was in residency, so huge disclaimer, by the way, like don't do drugs, kids. And this is a really, really good example of this. So when I was in residency in Massachusetts, people would use K2 and like they would get really, really messed up, like mess themselves up permanently. And it just messes you up so bad. And what we're seeing right now in substance use is that as we make 5 or 10 different variants of drugs, what we're essentially doing is selecting for all of the different variants, right? So if you start using drugs and you try out 5 different variants of marijuana, you may be able to find the perfect marijuana blend for you, which we'll get to in a second in terms of why people use it. But then what that actually does is opens you up to more addictive potential and more possibility to like really screw up your life. So you got to be careful about that stuff. But the other thing that the show kind of highlights, if we kind of think about it, is some of this stuff about, tragedy in the world. So if we think a little bit about what environment Rue grew up in, she grew up in the post 9/11 world. And this is the interesting thing about growing up in this generation, not talking about Gen Z, so mostly y'all who are listening to this, is that we've had like 4 once-in-a-lifetime crises within 20 years, right? It's kind of wild. Like if you think about, what this generation has had to deal with, it's been like thing after thing after thing after thing. And if we talk, we'll get into this a little bit more, but if we talk a little bit about what predisposes us to drug use, okay? What we're going to find is that this is the happy and content world. And then you get born into a world. But what kind of world do you get born into? Do you get born into a world that's like post 9/11? And then after 9/11, we had the 2007, 2008, economic crash, at least in the United States. And so that was like a once in a lifetime black swan unpredictable economic crisis. And then we've got like climate change, right? So the world is like, it's a little bit unclear whether the world will just straight up end at some point, right? Whether there's some kind of catastrophic collapse to our ocean system. If there's a catastrophic collapse to our ocean system and like all the algae dies, that's what actually produces, like traps the most greenhouse gases, right? Algae are carbon fixers. So they take CO2 out of the environment and they produce oxygen. And then if they die and the fish die and all that kind of stuff, we could see a catastrophic collapse to the world. We could be literally apocalyptic kind of times, right? And no one really knows whether this is going to happen or not happen. Some people think we're overblowing the risks. Other people think that we're definitely on the path to destroy ourselves within 100 years. I don't really know. I've looked at a lot of the science. It concerns me, but it's not my area of expertise. The point here, what we are focused on, is not whether the world is going to end or not, but growing up in a society where there's a lot of very strong scientific evidence that we're on the path to screwing ourselves, right? There's economic crises, there's climate change, there's stuff like 9/11. And by the way, there's also this global pandemic, which basically shut down the world for 2 years, right? And the human rights related stuff that's happening with COVID as well. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And this is the problem is that what is that doing to our psychology? What is it like to be a 20-year-old kid existing in the world today? And there's a counter argument here as well, where you can say that, humanity on the whole has gotten a lot better. And there's definitely an argument for that, right? So if you look at medical advancement, it's pretty cool that, we've basically eliminated polio through vaccines. We've essentially eliminated cervical cancer or reduced cervical cancer drastically through the HPV vaccine. So that's huge, right? People aren't dying of cervical cancer. I remember culturally and religiously, kind of the same thing. You don't name a kid until they're 30 days old in several cultures, right? Why is that? Why don't we even give kids names? It's because infant mortality used to be through the roof. Now people think about their kids' names before even they're pregnant. Like, we take it for granted that our children will survive, right? That is an assumption that human beings didn't have 100 years ago. So there's absolutely been progress. Like, there's no question about that, right? So we've got like solar panels, like that's pretty cool. We've got electric cars, like that's pretty cool. We've got technology and video games and virtual reality, and medicine is improving. That's pretty cool. We're in the days of like Uber and Uber Eats, and we have so much cultural exchange. Like, I can watch a Korean soap opera if I want to. Like, that's pretty cool. So life has definitely gotten better by a lot of objective measures as well. But when we think about the psychology of what it's like to grow up in the world today, we get bombarded by like some really, really scary stuff. And what do we do about that, right? How do we manage that? Like, it's like, okay, so you're telling me I have to go to college, right? And the reason I need to go to college is so that I can get a good job. The reason I can get a good job is so that I can be financially independent and then presumably get married and have kids and all this kind of stuff. But like, what if the world ends in 20 years? I've had several patients talk to me about they're afraid to have children. And it's like, why is that? Well, it's like, I don't want to bring a child into a world that's like apocalyptic because the climate is collapsing and then like human beings die. Like, that's terrible. Like, I don't want to do that. I've had patients who talk about the anxiety and concern about bringing children into this world, which I'm sure to some degree has always been there, right? So every generation is concerned about the world ending like in the next 100 years. I'm sure that there are people who sort of do that, but are concerned about that. But I really think that our exposure to this kind of information, the volume at which we get it, because it's always one disaster after another, right? Which has something to do with the internet and the way that we consume information, the way that information floats to the top. So what information floats to the top? The information that is emotionally charged. That's what we react to. And so what ends up happening is we see the most emotionally charged stuff from all over the world, day after day after day after day. And what impact does that have on our psychology? Well, it's like, okay, I've got a choice between this or this. And this is what I want, right? I want to go back to the womb where like there was no sense of, things are going to hell in the womb. In fact, everything was perfectly content.
13, 14, 15, 16.
What are you looking at, Rue?
17.
Rue, look at me.
1, 2, 3.
What are you doing, Rue?
So now you get kids who are growing up with some amount of existential dread. And this is where things are going to get a little bit tricky. So then what happens is like, you'll get some kids, right? And here's the thing. Kids are unique. Not all kids are the same. I don't know if you guys can kind of see this one, but she's counting up here. So she's just like counting things on the ceiling. And then the parents like look at the kid and they're like, wait a minute, I don't understand what my kid is doing. So I want you to think a little bit about, if Rue was born 200 years ago and she was counting objects, right? Maybe a little bit of like obsessive compulsive tendencies. What would a parent do? A parent would be like, I don't really know what's up, right? We didn't have answers for everything back then. But now living in the information age, it's very subtle. But we look at something and we see a kid and we don't understand what they're doing. They're maybe a little bit unique. It's a little bit of a strange behavior. And then like the parent is like, okay, what is going on? Because there's sort of this assumption that there is an answer out there. And I don't know if that makes sense to y'all, but like 100 years ago, there wasn't Wikipedia. Like we didn't have answers at our fingertips. In fact, like most human beings like didn't really have answers to stuff, which is why religion used to be so big. So religion would give us some vague sense. Oh, this is just like God makes each and every one of us in a particular unique way. Okay, period, right? Is Rue really doing anything that's problematic in this scene? Like, no, she's just like counting stuff, maybe a little bit distracted from her dinner. Like maybe that's, there's just something like a little bit weird. Like our kid is doing something that's a little bit sus, completely normal. But nowadays we need answers for everything, right? Because we've grown up with the assumption that there are answers for everything. There's a reason I'm doing this. There's a reason my kid is that way. And what's even more terrifying is if you're a parent, what if you're like messing up, right? So you want to be a good parent and your kid is doing something that you don't understand. So what do you do If your kid starts doing things that you don't understand, you can't let uncertainty be a part of it, because what if you screw up? What if you're missing something? What if something is going on? Because everyone's talking about mental illness. What do? We take him to see a psychiatrist.